Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to show you how to use Azure Bastion to securely access a private AKS cluster. The idea for this video actually came from a YouTube comment, so if you have any questions or ideas for new videos, let me know in the comments and maybe I will look into it. So the plan for today is, first I'm going to quickly recap what a private AKS cluster is, but I will also link you the video where I explain in all the details and show how to set up a private AKS cluster. Then I'm giving you a quick introduction into Azure Bastion and also an overview of the architecture we're going to build today. And then we are implementing all the services and we test them at the end. So now let's take a look at a private AKS cluster. In Kubernetes, we have two main resources. On the left side here, we have the master node. That's the control plane that controls everything that's going on in the cluster. And on the right side, we have the worker nodes. The worker nodes run our container as pods. And these worker nodes communicate over the API with the master node. So that's this API. And if we developer connect to the cluster, for example using kubectl, we also connect to this API and communicate with the cluster. In Azure, if you enable a private cluster, then this means that the API is not available from the internet anymore. This API is only available from within the Vnet where the AKS cluster is hosted. And today I'm going to show you how to create an Azure Bastion to securely access a VM, and this VM is going to be in a separate Vnet, but we're going to peer both Vnets and then you can also connect to the API. But before we do this, let's have a quick look at what Azure Bastion is and why we want to use it. The main purpose of Azure Bastion is that it's a jump host. This means we connect to Bastion first, and then from Bastion we connect to our VMs. And we can connect via the Azure portal or via a native client. This means we can open our SSH client on our Windows, Linux machine, whatever we prefer, and connect through Azure Bastion to the VMs. I'm going to show you both. And you can also use RDP or SSH. Today we're going to use an Ubuntu VM, therefore we're going to use SSH. Another feature of Azure Bastion is that you can create shareable links. This means if you have, for example, an external developer who needs access for a week, then you can create the shareable link, give it to the developer, and they can use this link to access the VM. The shareable link can also have an expiry date. So for example, you can configure it to expire in 1 week, and 1 week later, the link expires and the external developer doesn't have access to your VM anymore. This is great because in this way, you can't forget to remove the access and everything is done automatically. Another feature is you can record the sessions. So if you have very sensitive information or data on your VM, you can record the session and see exactly what the developers are doing on the VM. Another feature, and maybe the main reason why you want to use Azure Bastion, is that it connects over a private connection to the VMs. This means the Azure Bastion has a public IP, you connect to the public IP, and then you connect through a private network to the VMs. This means that your VMs don't need a public IP, and you could also restrict the SSH or RDP port. This is done with just in time, but for today we are going to allow the connection all the time. I just want you to know that this is also an option to even further restrict the access to your VMs. And lastly, when you use Azure Bastion, you have to create a subnet, and this subnet has to be named Azure Bastion subnet. Without this name, it's not going to be to work. So here we have an overview of what I just said. On the left side, we have the developer, and this developer can either connect via the Azure portal or via their native client to Azure Bastion. This is done over the internet. And then Azure Bastion connects over a private network connection to the VMs. Therefore, as I said, the VMs don't need access to the internet, or actually, to be more precise, the VMs don't need a public IP to be accessed from the internet. Now let's take a look at what we want to build today. So on the right side, we have our private AKS cluster with a private endpoint. That's something I already created in the previous video. Again, I'm going to link you the video with all the details. Today, we're just going to quickly create all of this, but I'm not going to talk about the details. Then on the left side, we're going to build or create a new Azure Bastion with a public IP address. Then we're creating a VM. In this case, it's called Jumpbox. And this VM will be able to connect to the private API of the AKS cluster. And to do this, we have to implement first the Vnet peering. This means we have to connect the Vnet of the VM with the Vnet of the AKS cluster. And then we also have to link the Vnet to the private DNS zone of the AKS cluster. I think it might sound quite complicated in the beginning, but I'm going to show you step by step in a mix of Azure CLI and Azure Portal how to set up everything. Now let's switch over to the terminal and start implementing what I just showed you. Here in the terminal, let's define a couple variables. That's the name of our resource group, a location, the name of the public IP of our Azure Bastion, the name of the Vnet that will host the Azure Bastion and our VM, and the name of our AKS cluster. So with this in place, we can create our resource group, and this resource group will contain all the resources we are creating today. Next, we're going to create our private AKS cluster. And this flag, the enable private cluster, enables, as the name says, the private cluster. This means the API is not available from the internet. And the no wait parameter means that we don't wait until the cluster is created. Therefore, I can just continue setting up the resources and don't have to wait around 10 minutes until it's set up. While this is deploying, let's create a public IP address. Here it's important that this public IP address has to be of the SKU standard, not basic. And all the other parameters should be self-explanatory. So we have the resource group name with the name of the public IP. We're using version 4, and we also use the availability zones 1, 2, and 3. This means if one availability zone fails, our public IP will still be available. Next up, we're going to create our Vnet. And this Vnet has just normal address of 10.0/16 and a subnet of 10.00/24. Now we're going to query the ID of the Vnet because we're going to need it later. And the reason why I didn't query it while we created the Vnet is it takes a couple seconds, I think, for the ID. And if you query it while you create it, the ID will be empty string. Therefore, I do it in a second step. And lastly, we create another subnet, this time in the 10.0.200 range, and we name it Azure Bastion subnet. This is, as I said before, the subnet for Azure Bastion. It has to have this specific name. The subnet is created, and now we can create our Azure Bastion. So again, we provide the location, the name for the Azure Bastion, the public IP address we just created, the resource group, the Vnet, and again the no wait parameter, because creating the Azure Bastion takes around 10 minutes and I don't want to wait until it's created, so I just can continue. While this is deploying, we can now set up our VM. So I'm going to define 3 more variables. That's the name of the VM, the username I use to log in, and my password. And with this, I can create the VM. Let's clean up the terminal and start the deployment, and then we take a look at what we're deploying here. I think it should be fairly self-explanatory. So we used the name, resource group. We're using Ubuntu 24.04. Then we provide our user and password, the Vnet we created before, the subnet. Then for the public IP address, we provide an empty string. This means that this VM doesn't have a public IP address. And it's not necessary because we're using Azure Bastion and connect over a private IP. And lastly, we are going to query the ID because we're going to need the ID in the next steps. But now we have to wait until Azure Bastion is created and our AKS cluster. So I'm going to stop the video here for a couple minutes and we'll continue once everything is created. I think everything is deployed, so we can switch over to the Azure portal, and then I'm going to show you how to use the Azure portal and Azure Bastion to connect to our VM. We are here in the Azure portal in the VM we just created, and if I scroll down a little bit, we can see here the public IP address is empty. This is because we don't need it. We only need this private IP address and then connect through Azure Bastion. And to connect with Azure Bastion, we have on the left side the Azure Bastion section. And if we click on it, it asks us for our username and password. But we could also use Enter Authentication if we had it configured on the VM. And then we could just click on Connect because we're already logged in into the Azure portal. So to log in with the username and password, we provide the username. I think this was Wolfgang. Then I paste the password and then I click Connect. So this opens a new window. Then it asks me if I want to enable the clipboard, and I'm already connected to the VM. So unfortunately, I can't zoom in here. Let's try it this way. There you can see it says I'm connected to the Ubuntu VM. This means I don't have to use any other tools. I can just log in the Azure portal and with the Azure portal log into my VM. But sometimes I want to use my native tools and connect from my machine directly. And to do this, we have to enable the native client support first. So let's close this window. And now we have to go to the Azure Bastion and reconfigure the SKU we are using. So here in the Azure Bastion, we have on the left side configuration. And in this configuration section, we have here the tier. So I thought I used the basic tier, but I'm already using the standard tier. And with the standard tier, we have more functionality. So if we scroll down here, we can see all these options are available now. This means I enable the native client support, but we can also enable a shareable link, as I mentioned before. And if you want to use session recording, then you have to use the premium tier. For now, native client support is good enough. Let's click apply. And this takes around 10 minutes to update the Bastion. So I'm going to stop the video and I will continue once the update is finished. The update is finished, so we can now switch back to our terminal and connect to the VM via Azure Bastion. So let's clean up the window. To connect with Azure Bastion, we use the AC network bastion SSH command. Then we provide the name of our Azure Bastion instance, the resource group, the ID of the VM. That's the reason why we queried the ID before. Then the username. Let's execute the command. And now we have to provide the password before we can log in. Let's paste the password in. And now we are as well connected to our VM without the VM having a public IP address. Next, we are going to install the tools we need to access our private AKS cluster. The first one is not CLS, it's clear. The first one is the Azure CLI. So we can install it with this one-line command. As always, I will have all the commands I'm using in my GitHub repository, and I will provide a link in the description so you can easily follow the demo today. Once we have the Azure CLI installed, we're going to install kubectl, and then we're going to try to access our private cluster. Now let's install kubectl. This should only take a couple seconds. And once kubectl is installed, I'm going to check what version we have just to make sure that everything is installed correctly. So we can see we have version 1.32.3. Everything seems in order. That's everything we need. Now we can try to access our AKS cluster. But first, let's define two variables. That's the resource group name and the name of our AKS cluster. Then we log in via Azure CLI, so we use AC login. This will give us a code here and a link. So let's open the link. Then we have to provide the code, select our username, and then we are logged in the CLI of the VM. This should only take a couple seconds, and now we're logged in. Next up, we have to download the kubeconfig with the Azure CLI. So we use AC AKS get credentials. We provide the resource group name and the AKS name. This downloads the kubeconfig. And now let's try to access the cluster and see what happens. So I'm just doing a kubectl get namespace. And here we can see we have a whole bunch of error messages. I can't find a specific error message, but here it says couldn't get current server API group. And down here it also says no such host. So it just can't find our AKS cluster. This is because we are running in Azure, but we don't have a connection yet from our VM to our AKS cluster. So let's quickly switch back to the architectural overview and see what we already have and what we have to do now. We are almost done. So far, we have created our private AKS cluster with a private endpoint. This automatically created a private DNS zone and linked the network. Then we created our Azure Bastion with a public IP address, and we created our VM. The two steps that are left are the virtual network peering and then adding the Vnet to the private DNS zone. We're going to do this first in the terminal, but then you will see that there seems to be a bug in the Azure CLI and it's not going to work. So we are also going to switch back to the Azure portal. But for now, let's switch back to the terminal and let's get started with the Vnet peering. Back in the terminal, let's create a connection between our Vnet and the private DNS zone. So let's paste the command, and we're using the AC network private DNS link Vnet create command. It's quite a mouthful. Then we provide the Vnet name, then the resource group where the private DNS zone is located. And this is the resource group that's automatically created when you create a Kubernetes, an AKS cluster. You can configure the name of this resource group, but by default, it always starts with MC underscore, the name of the resource group where the AKS cluster is located in, underscore the name of the AKS cluster, underscore the location of the AKS cluster. Then we provide the ID of the Vnet. That's the ID we queried after we created the Vnet. Then the name of the private DNS zone. And the first GUID here is always different. So if you try this out yourself, you have to look up the name in the Azure portal and replace this name here. Then the private link is always the same. Canada Central is my location. So if you use a different location, you also have to change this. And then the end is always the same. Lastly, I'm using the registration enable true. This means if I add more resources into my Vnet, they get a record in the private DNS zone automatically. So I don't have to set this up. Let's create this. Creating the link should take less than a minute. And the last step we have is to create the Vnet peering. This means we want to create a connection between the Vnet of our VM and the AKS Vnet. Vnet peerings can be configured in both directions. This means I can configure access from the VM Vnet to the AKS Vnet, but I don't have to configure the connection backwards. This means the AKS cluster Vnet has no access into my VM Vnet. There is an Azure CLI command. Let's paste it in the terminal. So it's the AC network Vnet peering create command. Then we provide the name of the resource group, a name for the Vnet peering, the name of the Vnet you want to peer from. That's the Vnet of our VM. Then the remote Vnet. That's the AKS Vnet, but in this case, it's the ID. And to say allow Vnet access true, because we want the VM Vnet to access the AKS Vnet. The problem is if I execute, first I have to add here the ID of the Vnet of the AKS Vnet. But if I did this and then execute the command, then the peering will be always in a synchronized state, because it says it has to synchronize the IPs of the remote destination. And I couldn't figure out what the problem is. So if you have an idea, please let me know in the comments. But for now, let's switch to the Azure portal and let's take a look at the private DNS link, and then we create the Vnet peering in the Azure portal. We are back in the Azure portal, and first let's search for private DNS zones. Here you can see I only have one. Let's open this one. Then we scroll down a bit, and here we have virtual network links. Let's click on it, and there we can see the link we just created. So that's the private DNS zone has a link to the Vnet with the name myVnet. What's also important is that the link status is completed. If it's not completed yet, it takes a couple minutes, then you have to wait until it's completed before it will work. So that's good. Now let's take a look at the Vnet peering. So we have to open our Vnet. Let's search for Vnet on the top. There we can see we have two, the AKS Vnet and the Vnet we created before. Let's open our Vnet. Then again, we scroll down a bit until we see the peerings. Let's open this, and there we add a new peering. So we have to provide a name for this peering. So I like to provide the names of the VNets that are included. For example, my Vnet to AKS. So I know that the peering is from my Vnet to AKS. This also reminds me that I should use a better name for the Vnet the next time, but for now, that's fine. Then we have to provide the subscription where our target Vnet is in and select it from this list. So we are using the AKS Vnet because we want to peer from our Vnet to the AKS one. So if we scroll down, we can also configure the connection. As I said before, we can have the connection one way. This means from my Vnet to the AKS Vnet, but we can also have it both ways. This means that the AKS Vnet can also access my Vnet. For the access to the AKS cluster, we only need it one way. This means we need it from my Vnet to AKS. Therefore, we can disable this setting here. It says allow AKS Vnet access to my Vnet. So we don't want this direction. If we scroll further down, we have to provide again a name for the peering. I'm not sure why, but I've just copied the same name. And this setting says allow my Vnet to access the AKS Vnet. That's exactly what we want to do. That's everything we have to configure now. So let's add this. This might take a couple minutes, but usually is quite fast. Yeah, so it only took a couple seconds. And what's important here, the peering state, it's fully synchronized, and the peering state is connected. If I execute the, I think, same command in the Azure CLI, it's always synchronizing. It's never fully synchronized. Therefore, we use the Azure portal in this case. So now we have created our AKS cluster, we've created Azure Bastion with the VM, and we've created the connection from our subnet to the DNS zone and between the two VNets. This means we have set up everything we wanted, and we can go back to the terminal and now test the access from our VM to the AKS cluster. Back in the terminal, let's connect to our VM via Azure Bastion. That's exactly the same command we used the first time. Then once we're connected, we have to provide the password. So we are connected to the VM, and now we should be able to access our AKS cluster. To test this, let's use the kubectl get namespace again. And this time we don't get any error message. This means we successfully configured the connection. If you get an error message here, then this means you either didn't set up the Vnet peering correctly, or you didn't register your Vnet with the private DNS zone. If you forget one of them, it won't work, and you will get an error message such as the host wasn't found. So that's great, everything worked. Let's go back to the architecture and let's recap what we did today. To recap, we created first a private AKS cluster with a private endpoint. This means that our API is not available from outside this Vnet. This also automatically created a private DNS zone and registered the Vnet of the AKS cluster with this private DNS zone. Next up, we created our own Vnet and created an Azure Bastion host with a public IP address inside this Vnet, and also created an Ubuntu VM. Then we tested the access from our Azure Bastion to our VM and could access the VM through the Azure portal as well as through our native client. But after this setup was complete, we still didn't have access to the AKS cluster. This is because we had to implement the Vnet peering from the VM Vnet to the AKS Vnet, and we also had to register our Vnet with the private DNS zone of the AKS cluster. After we set up both the peering and the registration in the DNS zone, we tested again the access, and this time it worked. This means we have a private cluster, and we also found a way to securely access this cluster without having any ports or IPs being open to the internet. And that's everything I wanted to show you today. If you have any questions, feedback, complaints, let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, please share it, like the video itself, and I will see you next week with a new video.